Luke chapter 14. Jesus has ended his 3-year ministry almost. He is en route to Jerusalem at his spring. He will be there in Jerusalem at the time of Passover, and of course he knows that it will also be the time for his crucifixion. Luke 14, verse 1. And it came to pass, as he went into the house of one of the chief Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath day, that they watched him. Now he's been in the house of Pharisees before. This is the third time that we are told that he ate in the home of a Pharisee. And verses 1 through 6 will deal with a healing. Now, it was quite common for to have a entertainment on the Sabbath day. It would have been held after the morning service in the synagogue, or probably at midday. And all of the food prepared would have been prepared the day before to observe Mosaic law on working on the Sabbath. 2. And they watched him. I do want to point out that that word watch is partirunto in the Greek. Para meaning beside. It's a compound verb, and they are observing him narrowly. We know from the verb use in the Greek, and it's almost para if you think of paragraph. Stand beside. So they were standing beside and watching him closely, not just watching, but watching with evil intent. 2. And behold, there was a certain man before him which had the dropsy. Now, dropsy in the Greek is hydropikos. Hydro, we know, means water, as in hydrate, and the dropsy would have been, as we call it now, it would have been edema. His tissues would have been collecting water, and he would have been quite swollen, and it would have been pretty obvious that something was wrong to all present. And this would have been as they went in before they sat down to eat or reclined on the couches rather than sitting. So we probably would not be wrong in assuming that the man with the dropsy was planted to be there at this Sabbath meal to see if Jesus is going to heal him, and for the Pharisees to see if they can bring a charge against him for violating the law. 3. And Jesus answering spake unto the lawyers and Pharisees. Now the lawyers would have been the teachers of the law, that would have been the scribes, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day? Now he is fully aware that he's been set up, and he pulls out a trick common in argumentation and debate. He asks a loaded question. Is it lawful? Now, if it is, if they say no, the people will be upset. And if they say yes, then they can no longer ever complain that he is working on the Sabbath when he heals a person. and that 4. And they held their peace. And he took him and healed him and let him go. So the Pharisees and the scribes elected to say nothing. 5. And answered them, saying, Jesus speaking, which of you shall have an ass or an ox fall in a pit, and will not straightway pull him out on the Sabbath day? Now this is an exception to working on the Sabbath laid out in Exodus 23, verse 5. It's perfectly permissible. And the Greek really, if it is translated directly, it is more fitting to translate it, would you pull out a son or an ox? Well, of course you'd pull your child out of the pit, and you would also pull your ox out, because the ox would have been useful, and because it is a work animal and a necessary part of the household. 6. And they could not answer him again to these things. The scripture lawyers certainly knew about Exodus 23:5. 7. Now, the healing is over, and we're going to have a parable. And he put forth a parable to those which were bidden, when he marked how they chose out the chief rooms, saying unto them. Now these were the invited guests, and when they are choosing out the chief rooms, that word rooms really should be translated places. There would be not separate rooms, but the table would have been surrounded with couches around which they sat and reclined to eat, rather than sitting upright in a chair as Westerners do. And these folks are seeking out the best places. 8. And when thou art bidden of any man to a wedding, sit not down in the highest room, lest a more honorable man than thee be bidden of him. Now, actually, as I said, it was not room. These were couches, and the most preferable were those that were the first, at the very beginning of the table, because they would have been served first, and the farther upward, then the lesser the position of the diner. And he that bade thee and him come and say to thee, give this man place, and thou begin with shame to take the lowest room. So you could be called out, he's saying, if you grab the first place, the choice seat, and the host asks you to move because someone of higher rank and esteem has entered to eat. 11. For whosoever exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. And this is a lesson about humility and pride. And we know that it was pride that caused Satan to fall, because he proudly sat on the mercy seat instead of continuing to guard it, which was his job. And Solomon has told us in Proverbs 16:18 that pride goeth before a fall. And he is telling us that a condition and a state of humility is to be preferred. 12. Then he said also to him that bade him, he's speaking to that chief Pharisee who is the host, when thou makest a dinner or a supper, call not thy friends, nor thy brothers, neither thy kinsmen, nor thy rich neighbors, lest they also bid thee again, and a recompense be made thee. Now we're talking about not just a physical supper to eat physical food, but it could be a spiritual supper where we are being fed truth. And he is saying, just choose those persons that you know will invite, and don't just choose family and kinspeople and those persons whom you know will be inviting you to to um, to recompense you for that meal by inviting you to their home. 13. But when thou makest a feast, call the poor. Now the poor wouldn't have financial trouble getting to the feast or providing any recompensation. And the maimed, the lame, and the blind, they would have a physical problem getting to a feast. And thou shalt be blessed, that word that is used in the Beatitudes. For they cannot recompense thee, for thou shalt be recompensed at the resurrection of the just, when the elect are come. So we are told to show our hospitality to those who are in need and not just restrict what we share with those who can give us something back. Doesn't necessarily mean that we put on a big feast and go out in the street and invite, but we are to share and to make our hospitality available to those who cannot repay us. It may be giving to the food bank. It may be working in a soup kitchen. 15. And when one of them that sat at meat with him heard these things, he said unto him, Blessed is he that shall eat bread in the kingdom of God. He has rather acted in a kind of a prideful way himself. He did a shout out here to get attention. 16. Then said he unto him, speaking directly to this man who made this pious remark, a certain man made a great supper and bade many. 17. And sent his servant at supper time to say to them that were bidden, Come, for all things are now ready. Now, that is a common thing when one would be putting on a feast. At the day and nearing the time, a servant would go and issue a personal invitation. But a more formal kind of invitation would have gone out way earlier, maybe days, maybe even weeks, depending upon the lavishness of the feast. So this is not just a feast made and they send out the invitation when it's ready. They sent the servant with personal request to come at the last minute, but it was not the only invitation. And they all, with one consent, began to make excuse. The first said unto him, I have bought a piece of ground, and I must needs go and see it. I pray thee have me excused. He's simply saying, I'm just too busy. Now, who would purchase a piece of ground without ever looking at it? Probably no one. Then this would mean that he just simply wanted to go take a second look at what he had purchased, and that, of course, could wait. And another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to prove them. I pray thee have me excused. 5, biblical numeric, symbolic of grace. He's bought 5 yoke of oxen. That's 10 oxen. Quite an investment. Would he have bought 10 oxen without knowing whether they were satisfactory? Of course not. He didn't need to prove them. He simply wanted to take his 5 yoke of oxen out for another look at how they could pull and work. Could have waited. And another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. Now, the merit of having married a wife, that would have been a very important event. But he's going to have the wife for a long time, it would be hoped. And all 3 of these are very lame excuses, and the same kind of excuses that we give today for failure to attend the feast, for failure to participate in church and study and being part of the serious Christian that we should be if we are followers. And these are very flimsy excuses. 21. So that servant came and showed his lord these things. Then the master of the house, being angry, said to his servant, Go out quickly into the street and lanes of the city, and bring in hither the poor and the maimed and the halt and the blind. Think of this spiritually. The poor in spirit, the spiritually blind, those who are crippled and limp in a spiritual way. Go call them, he says. And the servant said, Lord, it is done as thou hast commanded, and yet there is room. There's always plenty. He went into the street, and he gathered in, and he said, Still there's room. There's always plenty of God's grace. 23. And the Lord said unto the servant, Go out into the highways and hedges, and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. Get out and find travelers on the road, and people who are out in the hedges, and ask them to come. Now, it would have, in that day, in that region, have been a breach of etiquette to have started a banquet or big feast meal without having all the places filled. 24. For I say unto you that none of those men which were bidden shall taste of my supper, not today and not ever. Sometimes the excuse can run so deeply, and with the busyness and the concern with the life here and now, that the supper invitation is over and it is too late. 25. And there went great multitudes. He's left the house of the Pharisee now and finished this teaching. And there went great multitudes with him, and he turned and said unto them. Now he's speaking to the multitude. If any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. Hate is better translated love less. He is not calling us to hate our family and our children and our siblings and our own life, indeed, but we are to love all of those things less than we love God. He is telling us then, put God first. 27. And whosoever doth not bear his cross come after me cannot be my disciple. To heed the call. Now, a person going to a crucifixion, Roman cross crucifixion, a way of the death penalty brought to the region by the Roman government, would have been on public display bearing his cross. Now, he would have not borne the entire cross. The vertical part of the cross stayed at the place of crucifixion, and the person to be crucified would have been carrying the cross member and taken to the vertical place and then put up in the crucifixion for death. So this is public. We publicly bear our cross, and that cross would be any kind of thing that might come to us because we are public with our belief, scorn or disdain. And in fact, I can give you an example of a person whom I have known who, because she became a very public and vocal and devout Christian, earned the disdain of her mother and her two siblings. In fact, they ridiculed her and excluded her from many things, and she was bearing her cross. 28. For which of you, intending to build a tower, sitteth not down first, and counteth the cost, whether he have sufficient to finish it? Would we? It would be rather ridiculous. I can think of a castle, unfinished castle, along an interstate across Kentucky. And it's quite obvious that the person who started building that castle ran out of money and lacked the wherewithal to finish the building of it. So he is saying if you were going to build a tower, and that would have been a tower in a vineyard, a lookout, or one kind of tower, and if you would set out, would you not try to figure out how much money it would take to buy the materials before you started. 29. Lest haply, after he hath laid the foundation, and is not able to finish it, all that behold it began to mock him, to laugh and say, Look at that tower, it only got 2 feet tall. 30. Saying, This man began to build, and was not able to finish. 31. Or what king, going to make war against another king, sitteth not down first, and consulteth whether he be able with 10,000 to meet him that cometh against him with 20,000? Well, the kings in those days were the head of the military, and he would certainly want to consider carefully if he had the arsenal and the men to come against the enemy approaching. 32. Or else, while the other is yet a great way off, he sendeth an ambassage, and desireth conditions of peace. If he can see, well, I'm not going to be able to go to war, then he would send out ambassadors to try to negotiate peace. 32. Or else, while the other is yet a great way off. 33. So likewise, whosoever be of you that forsaketh not all that he hath, he cannot be my disciple. We have to be willing, he is saying, to forsake all we have. If that is what it takes, then we can be a disciple. 34. Salt is good, but if the salt hath lost its savor, wherewith shall it be seasoned? The salt in those times in that region was of a very poor quality, and exposure to the air weakened it to the point that it was no good as a seasoning. 35. It is neither fit for the land, nor yet for the dunghill, but men cast it out. In other words, we are to be a seasoning. We are to be salt. We are to, in the way we live our lives, put a savor on others and on circumstances. He ends, he that has ears to hear, let him hear. Great book of Luke, chapter 14.